ladies and gentlemen of Bucharest, Rachel Andrew.
Okay, hello. I've got the dubious honour of the after lunch slot, and I've got about 100 slides of code, so I'll try and keep you all awake. As mentioned, I'm Rachel Andrew, and as we've already discovered, I'm quite old. And that means that I've been working with CSS since when CSS started being a thing. I can remember when we were having arguments as to whether we should use CSS at all, or we should carry on using font tags, because we quite liked font tags. They were easy, and they were in the same document as everything else. That worked quite well. So I can remember those arguments. I've been doing this for a very long time. And as we've already seen this morning, CSS today is absolutely fantastic. We can do all sorts of really interesting things. Things that it, you used to have to use lots of chopped up images for, or JavaScript, or dare I say it, Flash. We can now do all of that stuff in CSS. It's brilliant. But there's one part of CSS that really hasn't moved on very far at all. And that's layout, which seemed to shudder to a halt at about 2006 and stay there. And we're using layout methods that really weren't designed for the sort of things that we want to do today. They weren't designed for complex applications, and they weren't designed in a world where responsive design was a thing. And so we see a lot of this stuff when we view source. And whether you care about presentational classes in your markup or not, this is conceptually a very, very heavy way of doing layout, because just like with our font tags, you're actually describing the design, the layout in the markup, and there's only so far you can go with this stuff. Every time you want a new breakpoint, you want to stuff that stuff into your markup as well. It's not ideal. I know we can get around that by using Sass, but essentially we're kind of tying the representation of our pages in with the markup, which isn't ideal. But we're doing that because layout today is fragile and it's difficult, and it wastes a lot of our time trying to get things to work. But there is hope. And that hope comes with a group of modules, and you've probably already seen Flexbox. A lot of you are probably already using Flexbox to some degree. We've also got CSS Grid Layout, and we've got something called the Box Alignment module. So first, the bad news, because I think it's a shame to show you lots of cool things and then say, oh, sorry, you can't use it yet. This is the state of things for grid layout, and you might see something really interesting here. IE only. That's because this spec actually came from the Microsoft team. So you can say thank you to Microsoft for the fact that we have this very, very interesting, groundbreaking specification in browsers at all. It came from that team. They've been doing some great work. You can also see the little flags on all the other browsers. And that's because grid layout is behind a browser flag in pretty much all the browsers now. It's in the Safari Technical Preview as well. And because support is basically a moving target, that page has all the support information on. I keep it up to date. So that's grid. The good news is, of course, that Flexbox is very well supported cross-browser now, and I'm sure a lot of you have started to use it already. And so what I want to do with this talk is actually introduce grid a bit, but in the context of Flexbox, and show how these things work together as a system for layout, rather than kind of competing specifications. And also, if you've already got your head a bit around Flexbox, you should be able to see how you can start using grid with the knowledge that you've already got. So this is going to be our new layout framework, as it were, a native CSS framework for doing layout. And these new layout methods, we like to talk about them in terms of the problems that they solve for us. And the reason they can solve those problems is that they share some characteristics that we don't see in the existing layout methods that we use. So these methods properly separate document source order and the visual display. And they give us true alignment control. They let us align things horizontally and vertically. They're responsive by default. They often remove the need to calculate breakpoints and add media queries. And importantly, they give elements in our design relationship to each other. And that's not the case for our existing layout methods. If I have two items in a layout and I've got sort of two blocks and I float one left and one right, I don't have any way to say to the left-hand block, can you visually be as tall as the right-hand one? And that's because they've got no relationship to each other. And we've been trying to create these relationships for years. This is a link describing the faux columns technique. Has anyone come across that? Anybody else old in the room? Yeah, a few people are willing to admit this. So this is tiling a background image behind one of your columns to make it look like a full height column because the content inside is shorter. And it's the same reason why people jumped on this idea of using display table. And the reason display table works, you turn your items into sort of a fake table with CSS, because then they have relationship, because tables, items in tables have relationship to each other. And so this works to sort of get this kind of relationship and allow us to do full height columns and things and to align stuff. So, full height columns. That's pretty much the basic behavior of Flexbox and Grid. So this is a Flexbox example. We're taking advantage of the initial default values of the Flex properties. Our sidebar and content are inside a Flex container with a class of wrapper. The sidebar then runs to the height of the content, and the colour on it extends all the way down to the bottom. And here's how we do it with Grid Layout. So I've got a grid on my wrapper element, and then I've got a sidebar positioned at line 1 and the content at line 2, and again we see that sidebar extends all the way down to the bottom. And in all of the examples I've got in these slides, this idea of things having relationship to each other is really important. It's kind of how they work. So, for as long as I've been developing websites really, and certainly since CSS Layout became a thing, we've talked about this separation of the source and the content and the visual display. And certainly when we started doing CSS Layout, we were using this as our argument to our sort of table for layout loving friends. We're saying, but we can separate the source and the display. And it was kind of a bit of a failed promise though, and particularly once responsive came along, you often find you have to compromise one or the other to get all the different breakpoints that you want. So if we take a look at Flexbox, we've got some navigation here. It's laid out in a row with Flexbox. The flex direction here is in the source order, but we could use row reverse and just flip the items round, and now they display visually in the opposite direction. We can also explicitly set order using the order property. So I've got a bunch of items here and I've given them a number so that you can see the order that they are in the source. And then we change their order with the order property. So you can now see that the order number 3 is now at the end and we've got 1 in position number 3. We're just using order to move them around. Now CSS Grid gives us the ability to move things around in not just one dimension, not just around a row or around a column, but in both dimensions at once. So here I've got a parent element, sets display grid, and I'm creating a grid with 3 tracks. And then I position some items. I'm using the grid column and grid row properties here. So that numerical value there is the line I want my content to start on. And so we can do this, and we can leave gaps, because the things are in their own place on the grid. They've gone into their own cell of the grid. They're after the line that I asked them to go. The constraint there is that grid items like flex items need to be a direct child of their container, but then you can just place them around on their grid. But in addition to this choosing where you want things to go, and I think we think of grids, create a grid and then we'll stick things on that grid. There's this whole other way of doing things in grid layout, and that's this automatic placement. So you can take a chunk of content, hand it to a grid, and then it will just lay out for you. So this is the previous example if I remove the positioning properties. So I've just created a 3-track grid and I've got this list of things and they're displaying 1, 2, 3, 4 in cells of the grid. Grid is displaying them in source order. Now if I add a few more images to that gallery, and now some of my images are landscape and some are portrait. So it'd be pretty nice if landscape images could span 2 tracks and the portrait images just have 1 track. So that would kind of make things better in terms of their proportions. So what I've done, I've created a class called landscape, and I've just said grid column end span 2. So span 2 tracks there of the grid. And what this gets me is something like this. So the auto placement algorithm moves through the grid and it displays items. It displays item number 1. We then have a landscape image which takes up 2 tracks of this grid, and then we leave a gap, and then we move on to the next landscape image because it won't fit into that gap. However, if I add a property of grid Autoflow with a value of dense, grid will backfill the gaps. It will move through the images, and when it finds one which will fit in a gap previously left, it will pick it up and it will put it in the hole for me, which is very nice for my image gallery, but not so good if it was a form. So there's a huge implication here in terms of accessibility. What happens if the visual display ends up completely out of sync with the source? What happens to people who are tabbing around the document? Ideally, this stuff should enable us to create the most accessible source documents and then use this power of reordering, whether with Flexbox or Grid, to display things in an optimal way at each breakpoint. That would be great. And obviously testing with devices to make sure that we're not creating a horrible mess for people. I think, however, there is a real danger that the reordering capability will encourage people just to forget about that. They think, well, it doesn't matter, the document doesn't matter anymore, we can just drag things around all over the place. Or worse, as I've already mentioned, things only become grid or flex items if they're a direct child of the container that has display flex or display grid on it. And I think there is a present danger of individuals, authoring tools, or perhaps JavaScript frameworks stripping elements out of the DOM in order to make a very flat structure, because then you could just lay things out on your grid. So I think that's something to watch for as we move into the future. And I think there's a whole bunch of conversations to be had as a community about how we do this stuff and how we teach this stuff. Both the specifications, Flexbox and Grid, talk about this problem and say that authors should be using order only for visual and not logical reordering. And the same for authoring tools. You know, authoring tools should reorder the source if that is what is wanted, and not just drag things around visually. For a really good look at this in practice with screen readers and things, this is Leonie Watson's talk, video, and she talks about this CSS accessibility problem. I would really recommend, if you're starting to use these new layout methods, to have a look at that video. It's really worth your time. So, stepping away from accessibility and reordering, we've also got this wonderful control of alignment for the first time. It appears that really the hardest challenge in web design for many years has just been aligning things, centering things on the screen, and these methods make that easy. And this is where we bring a new player into the picture, and this is CSS Box Alignment Module Level 3. If you've played with Flexbox, if you've used Flexbox, this is all the cool alignment stuff from Flexbox taken out into a new module. It's put into a separate module because it means that other bits of CSS can use it. And for the time being, that's grid layout. It could well be other kinds of layout in the future as well. It could be something that's floated or whatever. So basically, this is the vertical centering module. Although it involves more than just centering, we've got distribution of space, overflows, logical positioning are tied up in this module as well. So these are the alignment properties. We have justify content, align content, justify self, justify items, and align items. They're all defined in the spec. We've already seen a value of box alignment when we see a very simple Flexbox example. Justify content, space between, and our items are spaced out evenly. Change the value to space around, and an equal amount of space left and right is put on the items, so you get a kind of half-size space at each end. We can do exactly the same with a grid container. If the total width or height of the tracks is smaller than the size of the actual grid container itself, we can then align the tracks inside. We can use space around and space between to space out the tracks. What this may mean is items become bigger than we expect because obviously everything stretches either side of any gap and so on. Also part of this module, we've already seen that items in a flex container have relationship, and by default the value of line items is stretch, and that's how we get our equal height columns. So despite I've got some navigation points here and only the first one has got extra content in, they all go to the same height because they've got relationship and they're all set to stretch. So that's why full height columns work so neatly. But we can also do vertical centering if we want, with the line item center, and hallelujah, they all center against the main axis. We've waited a long time to be able to do that. And then we can align the grid tracks inside the container, again, assuming that the total width or height of the track is smaller than that on the container. So I've got a grid defined here. And align content controls the block axis, so aligns the grid rows. So if align content is ends, the tracks will line up at the end of the grid. And justify content controls the inline axis, so that aligns the grid columns. So justify content will center all of the tracks, and all of these demos are online, so you can have a play around with them later. I'll give you a link. So those previous examples were about aligning everything in the container at once, all of the flex or grid items as a kind of group. And all you're doing there is you're setting the self properties on the individual items inside. So here I've got 4 items laid out in a list with Flexbox, and they're showing the different alignment properties. So the first item there is the default of stretch. So that's the tallest item. It's dictating the height of the flex container. So the second is then centered. The third is aligned to the start, and the fourth is aligned to the end. And we can do exactly the same thing with grid layout. It looks like this. So display grid, and we've got this 4-column grid. And then we can align the properties. So we have align self center, align self start, because we're dealing with a grid container rather than a flex container, and align self end. So kind of putting this stuff together, I've got a form here. It's a login form, and it's displayed in the center of the viewport. That's something that we tend to do. So we've got this nice login form displayed center. So the main grid there is applied to the body element, which is set to 100 viewport height. The actual grid tracks, which you can see I've sort of drawn the grid there, they don't completely fill the grid port, which means the viewport, which means that we can align content center and justify content center and align the grid just inside from the width and the height of the viewport there. So that's the code there. And that just centers that box. And inside our grid, we've got some content that we want to align. I've got these 2 cells at the bottom there, below the form, and I use align self end to align the content to the bottom of those cells, in the case that one has more lines than the other, just to sort of neaten it up. Inside the main grid, we've got some nested grids. As I mentioned, for an item to be a grid item, it needs to be a direct child. So these aren't direct children of the body element. So I've nested a grid. Each of the rows essentially is a grid itself. So the grid that contains the label and form element is a grid container. And then the final row has got 3 tracks because we've left a space, and then we've got the login button. And you can see I've got this fraction unit here, which I'll explain in a few slides' time, because that's a new unit for grid. But on that last screen, what I'm using there is align item center to nicely align my labels and the form element with 1 line of code. Anything across that grid will just be aligned nicely. And I could have used Flexbox to lay out those rows. In an ideal world, if I had grid and Flexbox, I think grid's probably the better solution because we can align everything sort of at the top level. We don't have to apply that to flex items to give things width, which you would if you used Flexbox. And again, this is a kind of a key difference between those 2 specs, which I'll show in a moment. Being able to do this alignment of individual items and groups of items is something that's incredibly important with responsive design. It's here that things like that faux columns technique fell down. Because once things are moving around, once things are bigger than you expected or smaller than you expected, you need to be able to align them as groups. And these new layout methods are essentially responsive by default because they've been developed since responsive design became a thing. And it was in 2009 that we started talking about responsive design. That was when Ethan Marcotte wrote his article on the list apart about fluid grids and then started talking about responsive design. And that became something that we all needed to be able to do. And so we all began adding these unlikely looking percentages to our designs. And it's really from this point that all the frameworks started to come about, because calculating all of these wretched percentages constantly is hard work, and we needed things to do that for us. And it was really from this point that we saw more and more of this sort of tooling and frameworks to create grid systems. They started to appear, really just to take that off our shoulders so we could get back to building websites. So our new layout methods just do this stuff for us. We've already seen space between and space around. Now those values are responsive. They grow and they shrink according to what space they have available. And Flexbox goes further than this. It allows us to do things like proportionately distribute space between items. The flex property is a shorthand for three properties. We've got flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. Understanding these properties is really the key to really getting your head around Flexbox. In this case, I am setting flex grow to 1 and flex shrink to 1. And what that means is that the item, my kind of ideal width for this item is 300 pixels, but it's okay if it gets smaller, and it's okay if it gets bigger than that 300 pixels. So that gives me these three boxes of equal width, because they're all able to grow and shrink equally from 300 pixels. If I add some extra items and then say that the items can wrap, if I drag the window smaller, the items will wrap when they get sort of below that 300 pixel flex basis, and we get something like this. Now, because the items can grow from the flex basis, I've got 3 on the top. I've only got 2 items to go on the bottom, and so what happens? They wrap, and then the Flexbox splits the difference. They can both grow equally, and they share that space. There's not an easy way to say to the second row, could you please line up underneath the top row? Because what you want to do there is line things up in 2 dimensions, not 1, and that's not really what Flexbox was designed for. You can target individual items. So here I've added rules for box 3. All boxes can grow and shrink from 300 pixels, but that box, box 3, it can't grow. And we get this. So once the boxes stretch wider than 300 pixels, it stays at 300 pixels. So that's pretty useful, but as you can see, the track below, that doesn't change. They're still growing, they're still splitting the difference. In order that we can maintain proportions as element flex, we can assign different values to flex grow and flex shrink. So this time I've set box 3 to flex grow 2. The other 2 boxes are remaining at the default of 1. And we get this. Now in this case, that doesn't mean that the third box becomes twice the size of the other 2. It means that once the 300 pixel basis has been taken away, the rest of the space is divided up according to this proportion. And again, no effect on the row below, because that is a new flex container. Each row, if you're working in rows, or each column, if you're working in columns, becomes a brand new flex container. Space distribution happens just across that row or column. And this is a really useful site. This is a Flexbox tester. You can stick in any values to flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis, and it will tell you what you will actually end up with. It's really useful if you're just trying to work out what you will have if you use different values for those properties. It's really worth wrapping your head around how Flexbox works with those 3 properties, because once you can do that, you can do pretty much anything that you should be able to do with Flexbox. And you'll also understand how the CSS Grid FR unit works, because it kind of works in the same way. This is a brand new unit. It's a fraction unit, and it allows you to assign a fraction of the available space in the grid container. So just a bit like using flex grow and flex basis. Here's my simple grid. I'm defining 3 columns, all with 1 fraction unit as the width. So here we have again 3 equal columns. We don't need to have any placement. Grid will just auto-place those things into the boxes. If I change my definition and create a 600 pixel column and 2 1 fraction unit columns, Grid gives that first element and the first track there 600 pixels, and then the remaining space it splits into 2 and gives 1 fraction unit each to each of the other 2 tracks. If I change the last column to 3 fraction units, we have our 600 pixels, which is taken out of the available space. The rest of the space divided into 4, a quarter is given to the track 2, and 3/4 to track 3. Unlike Flexbox, we're setting the size of the entire column track. So if I add another row, the proportions stay the same. You're creating a grid and you're putting things in the grid. With Flexbox, you're kind of adding content and letting that dictate how things grow and shrink. That is the key difference between Grid and Flexbox. Flexbox is for one-dimensional layout. You're laying out a column or a row at a time. Grid is 2-dimensional. You're laying out columns and rows at the same time. So something nice about Flexbox, though, with the way it works, is that you can get as many items as will fit in a row. So in this example, as the window gets larger and smaller, Flexbox is just working that stuff out for us. And it's flowing the items. We're getting as many as we can fit in the row. That's quite neat. And we can actually do this with Grid. In this case, though, we create the flexible tracks and place the content into them. And we do that with this slightly baffling-looking statement. What we're doing here is we're repeating, we're saying autofill. We're autofilling tracks, as many as will fit into the container. And we want those tracks to be a minimum of 300 pixels and a maximum of 1 fraction unit. What this does is, after Grid has worked out as many 300 pixel tracks as will fit, the remaining space it distributes across the tracks. So you end up with as many flexible width columns as will fit into that viewport. And so you get this. And as you can see, the things line up right through the track. You don't get this space distribution line by line that you do with Flexbox. So in practice, we're going to be using these techniques together. As I say, it's creating a new system for layout. Flexbox and Grid, it's a real shame they didn't kind of come through the process as one thing, as a sort of complete system. I'm still being asked all the time whether Grid is a competing specification to Flexbox, as if the CSS working group were involved in creating some kind of CSS specification deathmatch to see which one wins. You know, they're different specs, but they have common things at heart and they're solving common problems. And so in practice, you'll probably use one or the other, and sometimes you'll decide that one thing is a better match than the other. So I found this example on the Tuts Plus website. It's a common sort of box that you see on websites, this kind of hero panel with different blocks. And the problem with this is, as you see, if you add a bit more content than was expected, the things overflow, because the only way to do this neat sort of layout at the moment is to fix the height of your boxes. Once you've got fixed height boxes, if someone adds too much content, if the content is bigger than was expected, or just something happens, then it breaks. It either all falls apart or it overflows or things get cropped off. This sort of stuff is really trivial with Grid and Flexbox. So this is the layout I created, which kind of matches the breakpoints of that layout on the Tuts Plus website. And this is the 3 breakpoints. And a key thing to note is that while the heights of those rows appear fixed, when there's not enough content to sort of push it taller, the minute I add more content to one of the boxes, the whole thing expands. So in this case, I've added to the sort of top right image there, the thing about angry people at balloon fiestas, I've added some extra paragraphs of text. And what that's done is the entire row has grown. So the two images to the left of it have also grown and extended down to make space for that. And that's this whole thing about things having relationship to each other. That whole row is related to the other box, and so it can all grow together. And this works by using the min-max function in my track sizing. So the grid auto row property, auto rows, that gives a sizing to these automatically created rows. You don't need to define your entire grid. In practice, you'll probably define your columns, and then Grid will automatically create rows as you add content. They'll be auto-sized by default, so they'll just expand to fit whatever content goes into them. But you can set a size for them. So in this case, I'd like them to be a minimum of 150 pixels tall, but I would like them to be a maximum of auto. So I'd like them to expand to accept as much content as get put in there. So that's fine if there's more content than expected. I might have this design in mind that says 150 pixels tall, but it won't break if there's more. And then I'm also using some Flexbox here. I'm using Flexbox within those areas to push content down to the bottom of the cell where that's the design decision. Something else to note is that, again, in the real world, this kind of content might be coming out of a content management system. And not all content management systems are really great at stopping people adding more items than were expected in the design. And so here, someone's come along and added an extra box that we weren't expecting to the content. They thought, oh, we also need to link to this. I'll just add it to the content management system. And then a new box has appeared, and we haven't designed for that new box. But Grid just copes with that. Because it's creating these new rows, it just creates another row, and the content goes in there. It's not pretty. The designer's going to come along and say, hang on, what's that doing there? That's not supposed to be there. Remove one of them. But it's not going to break. It's not going to be a mess on the website until someone sorts that out. So that's really where we're heading with this stuff. So I'm showing you all these neat things with Grid, and we can't use this stuff in production yet, but we will be able to start doing so very, very soon. We expect that probably early in 2017, Grid will land in browsers. And when it does, it's going to land cross-browser. All of the major players have got some sort of implementation at this point. If you go and have a look, you can enable flags, you'll see it all working, kind of frustratingly so, because it feels like it's so close. And so when it does land, we're then going to have all these old browsers that don't support it, and that's going to be annoying, so we're going to have it in new stuff, and we won't have it in old ones. But CSS has actually developed a way of us coping with this stuff. Because there won't be a browser that supports grid layouts, but doesn't support this thing called feature queries. Now, anyone used Modernizer? Right, feature queries are Modernizer right there in your CSS. So this is how you use them. Outside of any queries, I am setting a bunch of things to display none. And this is a feature query. Looks a bit like a media query, but we say at supports. And then we just have the property and value that we want to check for support of. So here I'm checking for display flex. And so if the browser supports display flex, then it supports Flexbox. And so we can then do some CSS for browsers that support Flexbox. And I can do the same for grid layout support. Remember, there won't be a browser that doesn't support this, that also supports grid layout, so you're safe to write your grid layout stuff inside a supports query. You can actually test for multiple things at once. So if you want to check for display grid and shape outside circle, you can do that, and then have some code for that. So because you're looking for property and value, you can be really specific with this stuff. You can be, if you know that there's one browser that doesn't support some property in CSS, just one little part of a spec, you can test for it like this. You don't have to be just looking for the entire specification. And that's the browser support for feature queries. They're really great. The modern browsers that are going to be supporting this new CSS are going to support feature queries, so you can use them, and you can start to use them already. And so what you're going to need to do, because obviously older browsers, like we've got IE here listed, but any other really old browsers or things that don't support grid, they're not going to support something. So what you need to do is you need to write some CSS and then use inside your feature queries, and you're going to overwrite some of that for your newer browsers. So something like this. That's the login form control that we were looking at earlier. Now, if I don't have any layout on that control, it looks a bit like this, which is kind of okay, but it's pushed up at the top of the page. It might be fine if that was just your mobile view. But it's not horrendous, it's probably usable. But we can tidy that up. I can add a few defaults for really old browsers. So I'll just use a bit of padding to push it down from the top of the screen. You could also use something like display table if you wanted. And I've given it a width, so it doesn't go right up to the edge of the viewport. And so we get something like this, and it's just pushed down. And when you go and look at the live example, you'll be able to see how that works. There'll be more browsers that support Flexbox than Grid, and so there's quite a lot we can do with Flexbox that's kind of getting closer to what Grid Layout gives us. So maybe we'll use a feature query and we'll add some stuff for browsers that support Flexbox here and do some of the alignment. And we can certainly do our proper vertical alignment with Flexbox, so we can do that. Now in this case, it's a fairly subtle difference because I've not played around too much with the internals with Flexbox, but you could go much further with it if you wanted to. But the form will be in the center, even if the page is very short or very tall. And then we can get grid, and we can do all sorts of cool stuff. So we wrap our grid sections in a feature query, and we deliver some grid layout stuff. We're using grid for alignment, we're using grid for the internal alignment, as I demonstrated earlier. So you can take a proper look at all of this online later. But we can actually overwrite the stuff we've done earlier with the new stuff, and then deliver the better CSS to the browsers that support it. And what this means is that in this world of evergreen browsers, your site gets better as people's browsers update. People grow into the stuff you've done. So as people's browsers are updating, and they're going to be updating all the time because that's how browsers work now, the site just gets better. And in some ways it's going to get perhaps faster, or the layout's going to render more quickly because you're using these newer methods. That's pretty cool. And certainly for small UI elements, you can start using this stuff an awful lot earlier. Don't think of Grid Layout and Flexbox as being, well, if I can't use it for my whole containing page elements, if I can't use it for my full layout, I can't use it. That's not the case. You can do a lot with this stuff in terms of small enhancements. And I speak from experience because my product's a CMS. People use the admin in IE8 and up. I spend my days worrying about browser support. I don't live in some special ivory tower CSS working group world. And so I do know that browser support is hard and that it's really frustrating not being able to use this stuff. But you can start to use it as an enhancement. You can make stuff better for the people who do have support while not leaving behind those who don't. So that's one reason to start looking at this stuff right now. And all of the demos I've shown you are on CodePen here, so you can have a play around with them. Please do. There's a load of stuff there. And for Grid specifically, I have a whole site full of examples, and I keep putting up new ones. Do go and have a play around with those and see what is possible. So I know that Grid is something that we can't use in production now. And I've mentioned that it's coming soon. It's probably time to start learning about it. But there's another reason why I really, really, really want people to look at early stage specifications like Grid. And that's because once a specification like Grid is out there and in browsers, it can't be taken back. It can't be changed. How it's been built, everything about it is kind of set. We can move on to a new level of it, and we can add things, and we can change a bit how things behave, but generally, once it's out there, it's kind of done, and we're going to live with it for a long, long time. This idea of things being developed behind flags, behind feature flags, is pretty much the way of the future. Vendor prefixes are going away. We're not going to be using those because the problem with prefixes, as we all know, people start using them for production code and then get upset when they get changed. And this is what happened with Flexbox. You know, there isn't a browser out there with a wrong implementation of Flexbox. The spec changed after they shipped that version of the browser, and so the things are different. So that's how we ended up with like 3 versions of Flexbox out there, which is just no good for anyone. Grid layout has happened behind the flags, and so any major changes, the only people who've had their code broken is like some browser vendors and me. And so that's fine. You know, we just update our examples and we update the test stuff and off we go. So this things being developed behind a flag is what is going to happen in the future. So that means that we, as web developers, have to kind of take the time to enable flags and look at the new features. It's really important because this is the list of the mistakes in the design of CSS. These are the things that the CSS working group are going to change once we've developed a time machine and we can go back and do so. And I don't want to add more things to this list. You know, I want these things to be kind of worked out before they get to the stage of being in browsers. And so, you know, the more that developers and designers, people who are building real websites, look at the stuff that's coming through and talk to the CSS working group and explain why things don't work or do work or what you want, then the more likely it is that we get CSS that works really well for all of us. One of the nice things is that the CSS spec issues are now on GitHub. If you tried to interact in the past, you probably realized that what you had to do was sign up to a mailing list that appeared to have come from 1990, and sort of this torrent of messages about all different parts of CSS would come at you. Most of them were only of interest to browser vendors. All the spec issues are now on GitHub, so you can just track the things you're interested in. You can keep an eye on Flexbox or Grid or animations or any of the specs that you think are particularly interesting to you, and you can file issues against the spec itself, and you can add comments on issues that are there. And you know, as a fairly new member of the CSS working group, there are certainly a whole bunch of us who are very interested in what other developers have to say, and we will pick up on those comments as much as we can. We really, really would like to see more people adding their thoughts about CSS, and CSS not just being developed by browser vendors. So, you know, do a good deed for your future developing self. I know it's hard to make the time to like go and look at some random specification you're not going to be able to use for 3 years. But think of yourself in the future using that spec and just, you know, add a bit of feedback, because I think everyone here has probably got an awful lot to say and a lot to contribute to the process of developing these web specifications. Thank you very much. All of my stuff is up there, and I'm very happy to answer questions now or later.
Give it up for Rachel Andrew.